You know that specific moment, don't you? The one where someone finally sees what they've done. Not the distant understanding you get from a therapist's explanation or a self-help book, but the real, embodied knowing that lands in their chest like a stone. For avoidance, this moment often comes too late, months or years after they've already created the wreckage. And what happens in that moment is something between denial, grief, and a kind of rage directed inward that they don't quite know how to process. Maybe you've seen this with your avoidant partner. Or maybe you're experiencing it right now, that strange phase where they're suddenly more present, more aware, maybe even trying. But there's something haunting about that realization for them. And understanding what's happening on their side of the pain doesn't diminish what you've experienced. In fact, it might help you understand why they're acting the way they are now, why genuine change feels so shaky, and why you can't quite trust it, even when your heart desperately wants to. The avoidant person's journey toward realizing what they've done is rarely linear. It's not like they wake up one morning and think, "Oh, I see now. I was emotionally unavailable, and I hurt someone I claimed to care about." That kind of clarity would be almost convenient. Instead, the realization usually creeps in through cracks that have been slowly forming, often triggered by something that feels completely unrelated. Maybe they're alone at night, and your absence hits differently than it did when they were pushing you away. Maybe they see you thriving without them, and the panic that rises up is so intense that they finally have to ask themselves, what did I actually do here? The truth is that avoidants often don't fully comprehend the damage until they're faced with the particular silence that comes after someone finally stops trying to reach them. Understanding the emotional architecture of avoidant realization. When an avoidant person begins to realize they've caused real harm, they're not just confronting what they did, they're confronting something much deeper about how they've organized their entire emotional life. Their attachment system was built on a particular premise, that getting too close to people creates unbearable anxiety, that relationships demand vulnerability they cannot afford, that independence is safety. And now they're being forced to feel the other side of that equation, that their safety mechanism has created a different, arguably more painful consequence. They've hurt someone, and that knowledge contradicts the story they've been telling themselves about who they are. This realization often brings what feels like rage, but it's actually something more complicated. There's anger at themselves, certainly, but there's also a kind of defensive anger that arises as a protection against the shame that's threatening to surface. The avoidant person might suddenly become critical of you, or of the situation, or of the relationship itself. They might say things like, "Yeah, you were too dependent," or "we wanted different things," or "I don't know how to be what you needed." These statements aren't entirely false. Avoidants often genuinely do have limited emotional capacity in the ways their partner needs, but they're also serving a function in that moment. They're providing a narrative that makes the harm feel less like a choice and more like an incompatibility. It's a way of feeling bad without feeling responsible. The thing is, you can see this dynamic happening. You can watch them cycle through a strange mixture of guilt and defensiveness, genuine remorse, and sudden coldness. And it's disorienting because you might find yourself in the position of comforting them about the pain they caused you. And this happens a lot in relationships with avoidance. The person who was hurt ends up in the role of managing the emotions of the person who did the hurting. If you find yourself doing this, if you're explaining to them why they hurt you in a way that feels like you're being empathetic to their experience of having hurt you, that's a sign of how deeply the dynamic has penetrated. There's a particular pattern that emerges during this realization phase, and it's worth naming because you might be living through it right now. The avoidant pulls closer. They seem to understand. They reach out more frequently. You start to hope. You start to think, maybe this is it. Maybe they've finally gotten it. But then, just when you're about to let your walls down, they do something that reopens the wound. They withdraw again. They minimize what happened. They remind you of all the reasons you weren't compatible anyway. And you're left wondering if the breakthrough was real or if it was just another iteration of their cycle. Genuinely feeling bad, expressing remorse, but then being unable to sustain the vulnerability that real change would require. The way this pattern affects you is worth examining. Each time they pull close and then withdraw, you experience a fresh round of grief. The hope itself becomes painful because you've now learned at a deep nervous system level that hope in this dynamic is dangerous. It leads somewhere that hurts. You start to become skeptical of your own emotions, questioning whether you're wrong to want to believe them, wondering if you're being naive. But the truth is that you're not being naive. You're simply seeing the pattern accurately. The avoidant person might genuinely experience the clarity of realization in that moment, and then, when their nervous system reminds them why they built those walls in the first place, they retreat. Both things can be true. The realization can be real, and the subsequent withdrawal can also be real. And you're trapped somewhere in the middle, trying to make sense of a sequence of events that doesn't quite add up because it's being driven by forces outside anyone's conscious control. The particular pain of delayed realization. What makes an avoidance realization especially difficult is that it often comes too late. You've already left. You've already built a new life, or started to. You've already gone through the grief, the anger, the why didn't they just love me phase. And now, they're arriving at the understanding that you had months ago, and they're arriving at it alone, without you there to witness it or validate it. There's something almost cruel about this timing, and it's why many people in this situation describe a profound sense of emptiness when it finally happens. The mechanics of this delayed realization are worth exploring because they reveal something important about avoidant psychology. An avoidant person often can't access the full weight of what they've done while they're still in the relationship or fresh out of it. The pain would be too much. So they operate in a kind of protective fog, a dissociative state where they can acknowledge in theory that they weren't present while still maintaining enough distance from the feeling of it that it doesn't overwhelm them. It's only when they've had enough time, enough separation, enough experience of being alone with only their own company that the fog begins to lift. And when it does, when they can finally feel the full weight of their isolation and understand that they created it by pushing away the one person who was reaching for them, that's when the realization hits with force. This has an important implication for you. The fact that they're having the realization now doesn't mean they weren't wrong before. It doesn't mean that your pain during the relationship was invalid or unnecessary. What it means is that they've finally reached a point where they can tolerate feeling what they did. And in some ways, that's too bad for them because you've moved through your pain and into healing. You're in a different place now. You're not waiting for the apology anymore. You're not standing in that gap between what happened and what you needed to happen. You've stepped out of that space and you've created something new in it. The avoidant person's realization, arriving as it does, is a belated thing. It's not redemptive in the way they might hope it will be. The avoidant person might reach out after silence. They might say they've changed, that they understand now, that they want another chance. And here's where it gets psychologically intricate because some of them genuinely have done the internal work. They've thought about the patterns they saw in their parents. They've noticed how they've replayed this same dynamic in other relationships. They've felt the weight of their solitude and started to question whether that solitude was actually safety or just a well-dressed prison. These realizations are real and they matter. But here's what you need to understand. Realization is not the same as transformation. Understanding intellectually that you hurt someone is not the same as having rebuilt your nervous system so that you can actually tolerate closeness without the old panic returning. This is the distinction that often breaks people when they try to reconcile with an avoidant who claims to have changed. The avoidant might genuinely see what they've done, genuinely wish they could undo it, genuinely want to be different, but their nervous system hasn't actually been rewired yet. It might never be, not to the degree that your nervous system needs. This is perhaps the hardest thing for people in your situation to accept. It would be so much simpler if realization automatically led to change, if understanding the problem automatically fixed it. But the brain doesn't work that way, particularly not the nervous system that has been encoded since early childhood. The avoidant person's body has learned, through years or decades of practice, to respond to intimacy with anxiety. The amygdala, the fear center of the brain, has been trained to recognize closeness as a threat. When that threat is perceived, the nervous system triggers a cascade of physiological responses: elevated heart rate, shallow breathing, tension in the chest and stomach, the overwhelming urge to escape. This is not happening at a conscious level. It's not something the person can logic their way out of, and their intellectual understanding that you are worth staying for doesn't touch this nervous system response. And until they can literally retrain their nervous system through therapy, through trauma work, through slowly, repeatedly staying present to the fear instead of running from it, the old patterns will return. Every time. Without fail. The tension between intellectual understanding and nervous system change is crucial to grasp here. An avoidant person can understand, with complete clarity, that their parents' emotional withdrawal taught them to believe that needing anyone was dangerous. They can see the pattern repeated across their friendships and romantic relationships. They can recognize, in therapy or in a moment of solitude, that this pattern has cost them. They can feel genuine sadness about that. But when they're actually in a relationship again, when you're asking for vulnerability or presence or emotional attunement, their body doesn't know about the intellectual insight. Their body still floods with the same panic it learned when they were a child. And the impulse to retreat, to create distance, to build the walls back up, that impulse is automatic. It's not coming from their conscious mind. It's coming from a nervous system that was trained in the language of escape, and that nervous system has its own timeline for change. Some nervous systems, with intense therapeutic work, can be retrained. But the retraining is not quick, and it's not permanent without ongoing attention and practice. This is what separates those who have surface-level realizations from those who have genuine transformations. And the person who just intellectually understands the pattern can articulate it beautifully. They can describe how their mother was cold, how they learned not to need anyone, how that's manifesting in their relationships now. But the moment actual vulnerability is required, the moment there's real stakes in the room, their body overrides their understanding. The person who is actually transforming is someone who can feel the impulse to retreat, notice it happening, and choose, over and over again, to stay. That's a different animal entirely, and it requires not just willingness, but also a kind of courage that many people, when they reach that crossroads, simply don't have. When an avoidant person reaches out to you after months of silence, claiming they've realized what they've done, it's important to notice what you feel in your body. Does it feel like relief? Like vindication? Like maybe you were right all along, and now they finally see it? That's the feeling that traps people, because that feeling is real. It is validating to be finally understood by someone who has hurt you. But the danger is that this validation can become addictive. You can start to need their recognition of the harm in order to feel like the harm was real. And when that recognition starts to fade, when their anxiety returns, and they start withdrawing again, you're left questioning everything. Did they really understand? Did the harm really matter? Was it actually as bad as you thought? The avoidant person, by cycling through realization and regression, can inadvertently gaslight you into doubting your own experience. And that's perhaps one of the most damaging things that can happen in the aftermath of an avoidant relationship. Not just the original harm, but the erosion of your ability to trust your own perception of what happened. The shame that motivates change, or doesn't shame, is the feeling that avoidants often use to motivate themselves toward change. It's a painful emotion, and they'll do almost anything to escape it, which is exactly the problem. Avoidants are already exceptional at escaping painful emotions. They've spent their entire lives becoming invisible when feelings got too big, withdrawing when intimacy demanded more than they could give, rationalizing their way out of responsibility. When shame arrives, they have a whole arsenal of escape routes. They can disappear again. They can convince themselves that you were impossible to satisfy anyway. They can reframe the narrative until they're the victim of your demands rather than the architect of your loss. But sometimes, if the isolation gets deep enough, if the consequences become undeniable enough, shame can break through those defenses. And when it does, the avoidant person is confronted with something they've rarely had to face: the full weight of another person's pain that they caused. Not the abstract concept of it, not the intellectual understanding, but the actual reality that you suffered, that you called out to them and they weren't there, that you needed something from them and they couldn't give it, not because you were unreasonable, but because they were too broken to do it. This is when you might see something shift. Not the performance of change, where they text more and show up on time and use better language about their feelings. Those things can be genuine, but they're often surface level. The real shift is when the avoidant person stops defending their behavior quite so fiercely, when they stop looking for reasons why it wasn't their fault, when they can say, "I did this, I chose this, even if I didn't fully understand what I was choosing, and I caused you real pain." That statement, if it comes from a genuine place, is worth something, but it doesn't erase what happened, and it doesn't automatically make a future relationship possible. The weight of shame, when it finally lands on an avoidant person, can be absolutely devastating. For so long, they've managed their inner world by staying numb to the full emotional implications of their actions. And they've rationalized, minimized, and deflected. But when realization breaks through, when they can no longer maintain the fiction that they were just protecting themselves, that you were too needy, that it was incompatibility and not avoidance, the shame can feel crushing. And here's the psychological truth that's important to understand: that shame, while uncomfortable, is actually necessary. It's the emotion that rebuilds the bridge between their actions and the consequences of their actions. Without shame, there's no genuine change. There's just avoidance of a different kind. Shame is not pleasant, but it's the price of growth. The danger for you is becoming the object of their shame processing. They might contact you, wanting to work through what they're feeling, needing you to help them feel better about the harm they caused. And this is a subtle trap. On the surface, it seems like growth. They're feeling remorse. But underneath, it's still the same pattern. They're still asking you to absorb their emotional labor. They're still centering their experience of guilt instead of your experience of pain. True change would be them doing this work with a therapist, with a trusted friend, with anyone other than you. When they turn to you for absolution, what they're really doing is asking you to make their shame go away so they can feel better. And that's not your job. That's never your job. What happens to the avoidant when they realize they're alone? One of the most psychologically potent moments for an avoidant comes when they finally internalize that their independence, which they've protected so fiercely, has resulted in profound isolation. They might have friends, they might have a career, might have all the external markers of a successful life, but they're alone in a way that cuts deep, and it's a particular kind of alone because it's the alone they created. When an avoidant person says they want independence, what they often mean is that they want the absence of demands. They want not to be needed, because being needed means being vulnerable to the possibility that they'll fail to show up. They want solitude as a fortress, a place where no one can reach them, and therefore no one can hurt them. But there's a paradox hidden in this protection. The more successfully they construct their fortress, the more isolated they become. And isolation is not the same as solitude. Solitude is peaceful, it's chosen, it's restorative. Isolation is the silence that echoes. It's the realization at 2 a.m. that there is no one who would be devastated if something happened to you. It's the understanding that you have successfully protected yourself from being hurt by others, and in doing so, you've ensured that you'll never be loved by anyone either. This realization, when it comes, often catalyzes the avoidant person's journey toward change, because they finally understand that they didn't protect themselves from pain. They just traded one kind of pain for another. The pain of potential rejection and abandonment was replaced by the pain of certain, complete, self-imposed isolation. And that trade, once fully understood, feels like a terrible loss. The avoidant person often reaches this realization when there's no longer anyone reaching for them. When the supply of people trying to get close, it's trying to bridge the gap, trying to make the relationship work, when that supply finally runs out. This is actually when change becomes possible, because they can no longer deny that the pattern is real. They can't tell themselves that everyone else was too needy, that they had incompatible attachment styles, that they actually prefer being alone. Because now they're experiencing the full weight of what being alone actually means, and it's not the peaceful solitude they convince themselves it would be. It's the kind of alone that echoes through empty apartments. It's the kind of alone that shows up at 3 a.m. when they can't sleep, when the quiet is so loud they can hear their own thoughts, and all those thoughts are variations on, I did this. There's a particular geometry to this kind of loneliness. It's not the temporary loneliness of a breakup, where you still have the narrative that the person is out there somewhere, and there's a chance things could be different. It's the loneliness of looking at a pattern that keeps repeating across different people in different contexts, and finally understanding that the common variable is them. This is where some avoidants have a genuine awakening, because there's no one left to blame. There's no external narrative that can stand up anymore. The only story that fits the evidence is the story where they, repeatedly and predictably, chose distance over connection. And that story is devastating to integrate. Some avoidants never come back from this realization. They double down on the independence narrative. They tell themselves that they're just not built for relationships, that they're meant to be solitary, that other people are ultimately disappointing anyway. This is a protective stance, and it works in the way that isolation works. It protects you from ever being hurt again by another person, but it also seals you in a very small life. But other avoidants, when they hit this wall, do start to wonder if there was a different way they could have handled things. If they could have been braver, if they could have stayed. The question they're asking themselves, when an avoidant realizes they've destroyed your heart, they're asking themselves the question that you've probably asked yourself. Was it worth it? Was the safety of distance worth the cost of this aloneness? And the answer, if they're being honest, is often no. And the safety they protected was an illusion anyway. There's no distance far enough that they don't feel the effects of their choices. The cost turned out to be higher than the benefit. They got what they wanted in one sense. They avoided the anxiety of deep intimacy, but they lost something they didn't think they needed until it was gone. This realization doesn't always lead anywhere productive. Sometimes it just leads to more guilt, more shame, more defensiveness. The avoidant person might reach out to you in a moment of weakness, apologize intensely, promise change, and then when you start to soften and open the door again, the old anxiety kicks back in and they retreat. They've given themselves the false comfort of the apology without actually doing the work of change. They feel better because they acknowledge the harm, but they haven't actually addressed the patterns that caused the harm in the first place. The cycle you might observe, where they seem to understand, then they seem to regress, then they understand again, then they retreat, isn't necessarily them playing games. It's them cycling through the tension between wanting to change and being terrified of what change would require. Understanding that you hurt someone is psychologically easier than actually staying present to the fear that would come if you tried to build a healthier relationship. The apology can give them temporary relief from the discomfort of their realization. But it's a surface relief. The deeper anxiety remains untouched, waiting to reassert itself as soon as you mention anything that requires real vulnerability from them. But sometimes, and this is important, sometimes the realization sticks. Sometimes an avoidant person, after hitting the bottom of their isolation, does the real work. They go to therapy not because someone is pushing them, but because they're facing themselves and they don't like what they see. They start to understand that their parents' withdrawal taught them that love was conditional on not needing anyone. They start to notice in real time when their body is flooding with the anxiety that sends them retreating. They start to choose to stay in that anxiety instead of escaping it. They develop what therapists call distress tolerance, the capacity to feel uncomfortable without needing to make it go away immediately. These are small shifts, but they're the ones that actually change the architecture of attachment. And when they make these shifts, they're usually not doing it with you in mind. They're doing it for themselves. The complication of their realization for you, here's what I want you to hold. Their realization is not your responsibility to process or manage. You have already done the work of feeling your pain about what they did. You have already gone through the phases of this grief. You might be in a place now where you're tempted to give them credit for finally understanding what happened, or to take on their shame with them in some kind of mutual healing. But that's the old dynamic reasserting itself. That's the pattern where your emotional labor goes into managing their experience of having hurt you. If an avoidant comes to you with genuine realization, with humility, with an understanding of what they did and why they did it, that's something to acknowledge. But acknowledgement is not the same as a reason to undo the boundaries you've built. You can hold space for someone's growth without becoming complicit in undoing your own healing. You can wish them well on their journey toward change without making that journey about you, without allowing their late arrival at understanding to reframe the entire story of what happened between you. The most compassionate thing you can do, in some sense, is to let them experience the full consequences of their choices. Not to punish them, but to let the reality of their isolation actually teach them what they need to learn. If you keep them from feeling that full weight, if you respond to their apology by creating a space where they can feel better without actually having changed, then you're robbing them of the very thing that might actually transform them, and you're setting yourself up to go through the same cycle again. When the realization isn't real, you should also be prepared for the possibility that what looks like realization is actually just another form of avoidant behavior. I've realized I've hurt you and I'm devastated by it narrative can become another story. An avoidant person tells themselves to feel like they're processing something when they're actually just creating a new protective narrative. They feel bad. They integrate that feeling. They imagine a version of themselves that's learned from this, and then they move forward without actually changing any of the patterns that caused the harm in the first place. This looks like someone who is very articulate about what they did wrong, very apologetic, very self-aware, but who, when you're back in relationship with them, falls right back into the same behaviors. They understood it intellectually, and they felt bad about it emotionally, but they never actually rebuilt the nervous system response. So when intimacy starts to feel threatening, when you need something from them that demands vulnerability, when the situation starts to mirror the one that made them panic before, the old patterns return, and then they're confused about why. If they understood the problem, if they felt bad about the harm, if they wanted to change, why can't they just do it? The answer is that they never actually built new capacity. They just built a new narrative about who they are. And narratives are brittle things. They break the moment the nervous system feels threatened. This is where you have to be sober. Understanding why someone hurt you is not the same as that person being capable of not hurting you again. Realization is the first step, but it's just the first step. Real change requires sustained effort, real therapeutic work, actual nervous system rewiring. And many avoidants don't have the sustained patience for that. They want the solution to be quicker than it actually is. They want to be able to apologize and then move forward, without having to sit in the discomfort of actually changing how they respond to fear in relationships. The humanity in their pain. I'm saying all of this, and I want to be clear. The avoidant person's pain about what they've done is real. Their suffering in that realization is not less real than yours, even though the cause and effect is different. They didn't intend to hurt you, even though their lack of intention doesn't erase the hurt. They were operating from a nervous system that was trying to keep them safe in the only way it knew how. That doesn't make what they did okay, but it makes it human. It makes it the kind of tragedy that unfolds when two people with different nervous systems try to love each other without understanding what they're actually working with. The avoidant person who finally understands what they've done is often in tremendous pain. They're looking back at their life and seeing a pattern of connection that they've sabotaged over and over, and they're grieving the person you could have been together if they'd been able to stay. They're grieving themselves, the self that could have been more open, more willing, more brave. They're sitting with the knowledge that they will likely never get another chance with you, and that there may not be anyone else waiting for the version of them that they might become. This is a particular kind of suffering that comes from finally being able to see yourself clearly and not liking what you see. And yet, this suffering, real as it is not your responsibility to alleviate. This is where compassion and boundaries become essential. You can hold compassion for their pain without making that pain your problem to solve. You can understand their suffering while still refusing to be the vehicle through which they process it. In fact, the most truly compassionate thing you can do is to not let them off the hook of their own grief. When they reach out to you with their realization, when they express how much they're hurting about what they've lost, the compassionate response is not to comfort them. It's to let them feel it fully. It's to say, yes, this is what loss feels like. This is the consequence of your choices. I hope this teaches you something important. And then you let them go again. You let them sit with the weight of it without you there to make it lighter. And maybe this is the thing that you need to hold right now. You can understand their humanity and still protect yourself. You can acknowledge their pain about realizing what they've done and still refuse to absorb that pain on behalf of them. You can wish them well in their growth and still choose not to be the vehicle through which they learn to be less avoidant. These things are not contradictory. In fact, the more clearly you hold these boundaries, the more you're actually supporting real change, because you're not allowing them to use you as a safe harbor while they continue their patterns. If the avoidant in your life reaches out with genuine realization, let them feel what that realization brings. Let them sit with the consequences. Let them do the work if they choose to do it, and protect yourself in the process. Don't make space for them in your life that would require you to compress yourself again, to manage their emotions again, to make yourself smaller so they can feel bigger. You've already done that work. You already understand what it costs. The path forward for both of you. The version of change that actually matters is the one that's built over time, with consistency, with the willingness to stay present to discomfort instead of retreating from it. An avoidant person can change, but it requires them to rewire something so fundamental to how they navigate the world that it can't be done in a moment of realization. It requires them to choose, again and again, to stay close when their instinct is to escape. It requires them to feel the anxiety of intimacy and not run from it. It requires them to get help, to do the internal work, to sit with the grief of how they've lived until now. If an avoidant person is serious about change, they'll begin to show up differently, not just in moments of connection with you or other romantic interests, but in all their relationships. And they'll start being more present with friends. They'll maintain relationships even when things get difficult. They'll stop the pattern of depth, followed by distance, followed by a new search for a different person to start the cycle with. They'll begin to develop consistency, showing up, following through, staying engaged even when it's uncomfortable. These are the signs that real change is happening, not just the dramatic grand gestures or the intense apologies that create a temporary sense of connection before the old patterns return. Real change also looks like ongoing accountability. An avoidant person who is genuinely transforming doesn't just apologize once and expect absolution. They understand that they've broken trust, and that trust is rebuilt slowly through countless small choices to be reliable, to be present, to follow through. They're patient with the process. They don't expect quick forgiveness. They don't get frustrated that you're still wary. They understand that they've given you very good reasons to be wary, and they accept that it might take years for the wound to fully heal, if it ever does. Some of them do this. It's possible. People change their attachment styles, though it's not easy and it's not fast. But the thing that allows this kind of change is usually not the desperation to win back someone they've lost. It's usually a deeper commitment to their own growth, to their own liberation from the patterns that have limited them. When change is motivated purely by the desire to fix what's broken with you, it often doesn't last because the underlying fear is still there. The moment things get difficult again, the moment the relationship starts to demand the very vulnerability that scared them in the first place, they'll retreat again. What you can hope for, if you choose to let an avoidant back into your life, is someone who is doing the work for themselves. Not for you. Not to prove something to you. Not to convince you that they're not who you experience them to be. But because they've finally understood that the armor they built was also a prison, and they want to learn how to live without it. That kind of change is rare, and it takes time, and it's still not a guarantee that the relationship will work, but it's the only version of change that has a real chance of being sustained. The truth is that many people who begin to do this work decide, once they've started processing their patterns, that they're not ready to jump back into a relationship with the person they've hurt. They understand that to rebuild trust with you would require you to take on a burden you shouldn't have to carry. The burden of watching them heal while still managing your own trauma from the relationship. Some genuinely transformed avoidants choose to rebuild themselves first, in solitude and in therapy, before they ever consider reaching out again. And some reach out, offer what they can offer in terms of an apology, and an explanation, and then respect the boundary when you decline to reopen the door. This is what integrity looks like in an avoidant person who is actually committed to growth. It's not dramatic, it's not intense, it's often quite quiet, but it's real. And sometimes, if both people have done the work, if both people have healed from the relationship, if enough time has passed and both of you are different people than you were, sometimes an avoidant person and the person they hurt can rebuild something. Not the same thing they had before, but something new, built on a more honest foundation, with more realistic expectations about what both people can offer. This happens, but it's rare, and it requires extraordinary willingness from both sides. If you ever find yourself in this situation, know that it's okay to say no. It's okay to have rebuilt your life in a way that doesn't have room for them anymore. That's not a failure. That's growth. The empowerment in stepping back. What I want to leave you with, if you're in this situation right now, is this. The avoidant person's realization is their work to do. Your healing is yours to do. And you don't have to wait for them to figure it out. You don't have to make space in your life for their process of understanding what they did. You don't have to be the object lesson in their journey toward becoming less avoidant. You can care about them, can wish them well, can understand the roots of their behavior, and you can still move forward without them. Maybe they will do the work. Maybe they will genuinely transform the way they relate to intimacy and vulnerability. Maybe, years from now, they'll be a different person, capable of the kind of closeness that you needed from them. And if that happens, it will be something to acknowledge. But by that time, you will have already built a life without them. You will have already learned that your worth is not dependent on their capacity to see you and hold you and show up for you. You will have already found relationships that don't require you to wait for someone to realize they hurt you before they can offer you their presence. The realization, when it comes, is theirs to carry. Your freedom is something you can claim right now without waiting for them to understand why they lost it. And that freedom is worth more than the temporary relief of their guilt or the false hope of their sudden enlightenment. You've already done enough work on their behalf. Now it's time to work on behalf of yourself. You are worthy of a love that doesn't require you to suffer through someone else's slow journey toward understanding that you are worth staying for. Your heart, wounded as it may be, is exactly the kind of heart that deserves a person who sees it, values it, and knows how to hold it without needing to be taught. You deserve someone who doesn't have to be destroyed by their own isolation before they realize what you were trying to give them all along.